Colleagues, friends, honoured guests, it is my great privilege to open these proceedings tonight and to welcome you to the second Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture hosted by the University of the Free State. As we gain momentum towards fulfilling our Vision 130, that is the vision of the university, and you might ask why Vision 130? In the year 2034, the University of the Free State will be celebrating her 130th birthday. And our vision, our strategy is a strategy that we have developed that will take us to the year 2034, and hence the name Vision 130. And through Vision 130, we want to be an institution that strives to impact the world around us by promoting, amongst others, accountability, social justice, and care. This lecture forms part of the Vice-Chancellor's Prestige Lecture Series, and it is one of the critical memorial lectures on our annual calendar. And if you haven't picked up yet, I am Francis Peterson, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University. A special word of welcome to our speaker, Professor Stephen Clingman. Stephen, welcome. Our respondent, Mr. Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. I probably have got it wrong, but you're gonna correct me afterwards, Tembeka. Members of the university executive and senior management that is in the auditorium this evening, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Sergius Kamcha, the Director of the Free State Centre for Human Rights, Professor Dani Brandt, colleagues from the Faculty of Law and other faculties here present tonight. A particular word of welcome to Judge President of the Free State High Court, Justice Kagni Musi, Judge Martha Mbelele, Deputy Judge President of the Free State High Court, Martus de Wet, Chairperson of the Free State Provincial Legal Practice Council, very special, Ilse Fischer-Wilson, Bram Fischer's daughter, and her husband, Dr. Tim Wilson. Welcome to you. Ruth Rice, Bram Fischer's daughter, joining us virtually. Welcome to you, Ruth. Justice L.B. Sachs, recipient of an honorary doctorate from the University of the Free State, joining us virtually, and also a dear friend of the university. And also to all stakeholders who are joining us virtually. Whenever I read or hear about Bram Fischer, I stand in wonderment of who he was and what he did during his life. I'm in awe of the immense legacy he left behind. Almost half a century after his death, his impact seems to expand as time passes. Bram Fischer, often referred to as Bram Fischer, was a prominent South African anti-apartheid activist and lawyer. He was born on the 23rd of April, 1908, here in Bloemfontein, and lived an extraordinary life until he died on the 8th of May, 1975, in Johannesburg. His father, Percy, was a prominent Afrikaner nationalist and judge, which may have prompted Fischer's decision to study law at the Grey University College. It was a former name of the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein, where he was a resident of House Bram Fischer, named after his grandfather, Bram Fischer. House Bram Fischer, which was renamed to Bram Fischer Botapele in 2022 was the first residence at the University of the Free State. We are proud to call Bram Fischer an alumnus of the University of the Free State. He obtained a BA degree from the University of the Free State in the late 1920s, after which he studied for the LLB degree while he was working, and he obtained the degree in 1931. Bram Fischer is best known for his legal defense of Nelson Mandela and other leaders of the African National Congress during the Rivonia trial in 1964, which resulted in Mandela and others being sentenced to life imprisonment. Fischer was a committed supporter of the African National Congress and its fight for racial equality and justice. Seeing that he came from a prominent Afrikaner family, his decision to oppose apartheid and defend anti-apartheid activists was significant. He was also a key figure in the South African Communist Party and played a crucial role in coordinating resistance against apartheid. Throughout the years, Fischer's ties to Bloemfontein were strong, and he remained involved in political and legal activities in the Free State. Bram Fischer remains an iconic figure in the history of the anti-apartheid struggle, and he is remembered for his courage and, very importantly, his commitment to justice. In his honor, it is actually a privilege to announce the Bram Fischer Postgraduate Scholarship, funded by the Joffrey Trust and Sir Sidney Kentridge. And I think Sir Sidney Kentridge is 102 years old this year, living in London. And it's fantastic to, and we might talk a little bit later, more formally or informally, about the Bram Fischer Postgraduate Scholarship. The scholarship will be awarded once a year to 2 doctoral students and will comprise a full tuition and registration scholarship. The 2 inaugural recipients are Neo Komota and Kingdom Matsuniani. I just want to check whether they are in the audience. They're not here. Okay. The inaugural, and I think we should probably give them a hand in their absence. Fantastic. I want to say congratulations to you both, and may you continue to make an impact with your research. This evening's memorial lecture, delivered by Professor Clingman, titled Bram Fischer, or What Happens When the World Becomes Inhospitable, will consider the continuing importance of Bram Fischer in a South African and global context. While Fischer never surrendered his Afrikaner identity, he also transformed it by identifying with the struggle for the liberation of all South African peoples. Sentenced to life imprisonment, he faced an inhospitable world, yet his commitment was to make the world more hospitable to all. And I think it's probably more relevant now than ever if we look at what happened in the globe. Thank you once again to all our participants and attendees, and I know that this will be an enriching event. Hearty welcome. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Introduce you. Stephen, we also all can't wait for you to speak, but there are some formalities to go through first. Honored and much welcomed guests, friends and colleagues. First, my thanks to Professor Peterson for his gracious words of welcome. My name is Dani Brandt. I'm the director of the Free State Centre for Human Rights. And I have the honor now to greet and introduce both of our speakers, Professor Stephen Clingman and Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. If that is closer, Tembeka. So I'll start with the introductions, and then I'll have one or two small things to say after that of a more personal nature. We'll start with Professor Stephen Clingman, who is a distinguished university professor of English at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He was the chair of the English department and the founding director of the Interdisciplinary Studies Institute at UMass. Stephen was born and grew up in South Africa, so he is a South African, and we are happy to have him back here today, where he studied as an undergraduate at the University of the Witwatersrand. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford. He has held fellowships at a variety of institutions internationally, including at Yale University, Cornell, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and here in South Africa, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study. His books, he is a prolific author. He has published several books. His books include the novels of Nadine Gordimer, History from the Inside, and then an edited collection of essays by Gordimer, The Essential Gesture, Writing, Politics and Places. And then Bram Fischer, Afrikaner Revolutionary, a biography of Bram Fischer, was co-winner of the Sunday Times Alan Paton Award, South Africa's premier prize for non-fiction. Coincidentally, it was co-winner of that award with a Free Stater, Antjie Krog, for her book, Country of My Skull, I found out this afternoon from Stephen. Stephen has also published The Grammar of Identity, Transnational Fiction and the Nature of the Boundary, and Birthmark, which is a memoir or an autofiction, a book of autofiction. Most recently, Stephen was commissioned to write the catalogue for the South African artist William Kentridge's 2022 exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, the most substantial exhibition to date of Kentridge's work in the UK. The catalogue is available as a book under the title William Kentridge. Tembeka Ngcukaitobi is an advocate, an author, a public speaker, and I hope you wouldn't mind me also calling you an activist, Tembeka. He holds the degrees B.Proc and LLB, both from UNITRA, and an LLM from Rhodes University, and another LLM from the London School of Economics and Political Science. To say that he is a well-known advocate, I think, is an understatement. He's appeared in most of the high-profile political constitutional law cases of the past several years, most of which have been televised. So I saw when we arrived here that his face is well known to students, for example, and I assume it's from that. He's also, to those in the legal fraternity, known for his work as an advocate in cases concerning land and poverty. I think best known to me for that, in fact. He achieved the status of senior counsel in 2019, at the time having practiced as advocate only for 8 years, which is a truly remarkable achievement. He's acted on several occasions as a judge of the High Court and of the Land Claims Court. He's a member of the South African Law Reform Commission, and since recently also of the Judicial Service Commission. He's an adjunct professor of public law at the University of Cape Town and Nelson Mandela University. And he has published 2 books, The Land is Ours, South Africa's First Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism, and most recently, Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. So how will we proceed tonight? We will start with Stephen, who will speak for 50 minutes. Then follows Tembeka with a response of 20 minutes. And finally, Stephen has asked for an additional 5 minutes at the end to reply to aspects of Tembeka's response. This will be followed by a word of thanks from the Dean of our Faculty of Law, Professor Serge Kamga, and refreshments for all outside in the foyer. But before we get there, allow me 3 personal words of thanks. There will be a formal thanks at the end, but from me personally. First, to our 2 speakers, Stephen and Tembeka, also for being here tonight and for what you are about to offer us and treat us on, but more importantly, for accepting an out-of-the-blue invitation from a complete stranger, in the case of Stephen, and a distant acquaintance in the case of Tembeka, without hesitation and with a great deal of enthusiasm, and for your patience and your grace in the arrangements that followed to get you here, which must have tested your patience, altogether for being simply nice people. Thank you very much for that. And then second, to our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Institutional Change, Dr. Molapo Troela, because Molapo is really the driving force behind reviving the Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture at this university. If it were not for him, we would not be here tonight, and I particularly want to thank him for asking me and our center to arrange this. It has been a blast to do so. Thank you, Molapo, for that. And then finally, I have to say, our reason for being here, to Bram Fischer, for the life that he led and what he did for all of us during that life, and for the example his life, now long past, is still to all of us today. Thank you for that. And with that, over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Professor Peterson and Professor Brandt, for the introductions. It means a huge amount for me to be here. Dani, I especially want to thank you for your graciousness and hospitality, both before my arrival and since I've been here. A word of thanks to Mwanda Mokwena, who I understand did a lot of the arrangements for today, at least from Dani's center. My thanks also to Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. I was practicing this. Blame it on jet lag. Okay. Ngcukaitobi. Is that it? Okay, good. Thank you. Who has kindly agreed to respond. I must say it's an honor and a privilege for me to be able to give this lecture. Special pleasure to see Bram Fischer's daughter Ilse in the audience, to know that Ruth is watching and that Albie Sachs may be as well. These are wonderful figures that I have had the great pleasure to be able to meet in my own life. It's quite moving for me to be back in Bloemfontein. The last time I was here was probably in the 1980s when I was doing research. Very different time, different set of realities. And to see how much has changed, to land at Bram Fischer International Airport, and also to see how things in some ways have stayed the same, haven't changed in some ways. But I do want to say there's a benefit in unfinished stories, because unfinished stories means there's still something to do, still something for all of us to do. And I think that's part of my theme tonight. I've made an attempt in my presentation to stay close to Bloemfontein, Bram's birthplace, and where his life ended, but also to bring in global dimensions as well. So let me begin. I'd like to begin with a vignette, or more than one. The month is October 1898. The setting is the farm Hillendale, just outside Bloemfontein, and the hosts are Abraham and Ada Fischer, who are marking their silver wedding anniversary. There are nearly 100 guests, including President M.T. Steyn of the Orange Free State and his wife, who provided a huge and magnificent table centerpiece in silver. Some among the guests might expect a religious ceremony, but instead there is lunch outdoors under the almond trees. There are 2 huge tarpaulins, 3 tables are set out, flags arranged along the side. The guests play tennis and other games. Abraham had fashioned what he called a new tennis ground, along with other renovations to the house. Among the Fischers' regular servants were a groundsman, a cook, and a housemaid. Describing it all to his son Percy, who was studying law in England, Abraham wrote that some 20-odd traps of all kinds, he would have meant horse-drawn traps, made the outspan place look quite like a commando. Quite like a commando. It was 1898. No doubt they had some inkling of what was coming in a war against England, against the British Empire, that would last from 1899 to 1902. Abraham himself would go into exile to gather support in Europe for the Boer forces. And following defeat in the Treaty of Vereniging in November 1907, Abraham became the first and only Prime Minister of the Orange River Colony, and then in 1910, a member of Prime Minister Louis Botha's first cabinet in the newly formed Union of South Africa. His son Percy later became Judge President of the Orange Free State, though he had his own travails when he supported the rebellion of 1914 against South Africa's entry into the First World War on the side of Britain. Percy's son was Bram Fischer, whose family always referred to his grandfather as Opa Abraham, and he was born in April 1908, just a few months after Opa Abraham became Prime Minister of the Orange River Colony, into a story of great drama, triumphs, and reversals. It is aspects of that story that I want to follow this evening. But I want to do it from a particular direction, and here I return to that opening scene. The scene presents the very image of easeful hospitality, a prominent and confident family entertaining their peers outdoors on the warm and welcoming South African landscape, without a doubt as to their placement on earth or their belonging, notwithstanding the looming presence of a ravenous British Empire. Here a secular grace could find a home and extend that home to others in their circle. But who is outside the circle? What does hospitality actually mean? And whom does it leave out? What does it think, if hospitality can think, will happen in time? These are obvious questions. So here then is a second vignette, and it comes not from the world of the Fischers, but rather from a poem which has its own intriguing history. It is called Song of the Broken String, and I'll read it in full. Because of a people, because of others, other people who came breaking the string for me, the earth is not earth. This place is a place now changed for me. Because the string is that which is broken for me, this earth is no longer the earth to me. This place seems no longer a place to me. Because the string is broken, the country feels as if it lay empty before me. Our country seems as if it lay both empty before me and dead before me. Because of this string, because of a people breaking the string, this earth, my place, is the place of something, a thing broken that does not stop sounding, breaking within me. Something like these words were spoken by a man named Dierquine to a German linguist named W.H. Bleek and his sister-in-law Lucy Lloyd around the late 1860s in Cape Town. Dierquine was one of the 3 Scham convicts in the environs of that city. The Scham were among the wider San grouping, and in short order they were hunted down, wiped out, and their language disappeared. Bleek was doing his best to learn that language and write down the stories of the people he was speaking to. These stories were not poems. The version that I've read was made into a poem by Stephen Watson in 1991. He went and read the stories and turned them into poems. And through the broken history of this transmission, there's a profound tale of loss. The earth, my place, is a place of something, a thing broken that does not stop sounding, breaking within me. What happens when the world becomes inhospitable? The image here is of a string, an umbilical cord, a musical string connecting the self and the community to the world. What happens when it's broken irreversibly? What did Opa Abraham's hospitality leave out? What or whom do we leave out now? What is happening to a world which is beginning to seem inhospitable to so many? This earth is no longer the earth to me. I want this poem, this voicing, to stand behind everything I say this evening. After 1914, when Bram Fischer's father Percy threw in his lot with the Boer generals who resisted South Africa's entry into the First World War, Percy was ostracized and began to lose work as an advocate. He and his wife Ella rented out their house in Bloemfontein and repaired to the farm Bergendal, a portion of Abraham's original Hillendale. And there Bram began to live an epic, almost mythic life that would always infuse his sense of belonging in South Africa. The landscape became part of him. He felt himself a part of the landscape. His mother took the children to visit the rebel prisoners in jail, and one of them gave Bram a toy that was still in the family's possession when Bram himself came out of prison to die at his brother's house many years later. On Bergendal, Bram would go walking with his father every Sunday, getting to know every feature, every stone. There around the dinner table, Bram and his siblings spoke Afrikaans to their father and English to their mother, who was English speaking. This was a white South African identity in the making. On the farm, Bram played with the children of the black workers, two of whom many years later he remembered as Lul and Cholokwan. There was no sense of difference, yet differences intervened. Bram's brother Paul was playing tug of war over a gate with a black friend, Jerry Saila, when the gate slipped and hit Jerry in the face, who started to bleed. Paul felt for his friend, but was equally shocked to see that Jerry's blood was red, like his. When Bram was 14, he refused to sit alongside a black woman in the back seat of a car, asking his sister, Ada, to do so instead. Thus were the boundaries of race and sex absorbed deep into the body and mind, so hard to overcome, let alone eradicate. When Bram left school, he had a strong desire to be a farmer, the appeal of working on that landscape again. But he took to law like his father and grandfather before him. He left Bloemfontein for university in Cape Town, and then, after a year, returned to Grey University College. As a student, he became the first nationalist prime minister of the mock parliament of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students, founded by Bram's mentor and former school teacher, Leo Marquardt, at Grey School, just up the road. Marquardt drew Bram into local projects in Bloemfontein, primarily the Joint Council of Natives and Europeans, and it was there that Bram had a life-changing event. Introduced to a black colleague on the council one evening, he instinctively recoiled at the prospect of shaking hands. It provoked in him a crisis of conscience. As he related it in his speech from the dock many years later, he realized that it was he, and not the black man, who had changed from the boy who used to play with his friends on the farm. It was that event that set him on his long path of legal and political involvement. His eventual membership of the Communist Party, his comradeship with others of all races in the struggle for liberation, his arrest and imprisonment, his return to his brother Paul's house in Bloemfontein to die, his ashes which the state refused to return to the family. It was a life of belonging, a life of exclusion, in which the very nature of what belonging meant was transformed. Bram had seen the limits of hospitality in the world into which he was born, how for so many it was an inhospitable world. Without denying his origins or the history he came from, he did what he could to change the foundations on which that world existed. On one level, his attempt was to give the name of Afrikaner what its literal meaning suggested, the reality of being African. When Bram's family moved back into Bloemfontein, after their sojourn on this farm at Bergendal, the house they lived in was named Harmony. It suggested the comity and hospitality the Fischers prized and embodied. Bram came to see the limits of that vision, and yet the idea of some horizon of harmony, both in South Africa and in the world at large, remained for him his own underlying project. He sought out a philosophy that might bring it about. He wanted to change the inhospitable world, and towards the end, the world became inhospitable to him. What can we learn from his story now? Bram won a Rhodes Scholarship. Strange that he would have opted for something in the name of Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist his family reviled. And he arrived in Oxford in January 1932 in the dark gloom of winter. He arrived in the midst of the Depression and alarming developments on the continent, where Hitler was on the verge of taking power. This was a world in incipient turmoil, and to many the ultimate struggle seemed to be between fascism and socialism. This was exactly what played out just a few years later in the Spanish Civil War as a precursor to World War II. In some ways, Bram played straight down the line in Oxford, fitting into its culture. He was inducted into the exclusive Raleigh Club, which was basically imperial in its orientation, where they met famous people, the knowledgeable men of the day. But he also joined the Labour Club, and he ventured further afield. During his holidays, he traveled to Europe. He met Jewish refugees from Germany, and he attended student conferences. In the summer of 1932, he also set out with some friends on a journey to the Soviet Union, shepherded all the way by in-tourist guides. What was Bram's attitude and approach at this time? It's most unlikely that he became a communist then, much more likely that he was feeling things out, absorbing what he could. From the Raleigh Club to the Labour Club to Europe to the Soviet Union, it seems his intent was to discover the world as broadly and immersively as possible, to fashion his ideas about how he wanted to shape his life. He certainly was interested in developing a personal philosophy to guide him. If not yet a communist, he began to believe in a science of society where everything would make sense and fit into place. Furthermore, on the continent and in the USSR, he was continually thinking about South Africa. What could he find there? What was applicable? In the event, he both learned from and mistook what he was seeing. From the USSR, he wrote back to his father in Afrikaans. He still wrote in English to his mother, translating what he saw into South African terms. He saw Russian peasants sprawled at railway stations, waiting with what seemed an ineffable passivity. He thought about modernization, how Russia was trying to drag itself into the 20th century through a kind of forced march policy of development. How would South Africa do the same? How could black South Africans, like those peasants, be brought into the modern world? Apart from the condescension of his thought about black South Africans, this is what Bram misunderstood. Those Russian peasants were likely suffering not just from passivity, but from Stalin's forced collectivization project, the siphoning off of grain and food until massive starvation resulted. It's estimated that overall at least 5 million people died from famine in the USSR during that period. No wonder people looked passive and drained. In describing them, Bram compared the peasants he saw to South African blacks, and perhaps reproducing the language of his father, he used an unfortunate South African term to do so. Bram was looking for a way to make the globe better, more inclusive, more rational. But again, look at what his version of inclusion left out, or who it left out, whether in the USSR or South Africa. Look at what his language left out and what it reproduced. I hope you'll understand I'm trying to paint a real picture here of a real human being, trying to make sense of his life, making mistakes the way I think we all make mistakes, but working through them to some other place of understanding. Where did a majority of those starved peasants come from? Already in 1932, but even more so in 1933, they came from the grainlands of Ukraine, where so many died. And given that where we are in 2023, in the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are echoes of these events to this day. For those peasants in Ukraine, the world had changed. The earth, their earth, was no longer a place to them. And if we draw the analogy back to South Africa, the echoes are there as well. There are anomalies everywhere one looks, and Bram Fischer, as these passages suggest, certainly had his own. He was looking towards a world beyond anomaly, unified under a grand and rational scheme of liberty. Despite the anomalies, he was not wrong to hope for that, and he lived in a different time when such hope, perhaps naive in some ways, was still part of a general legacy of thought. The journey was not and could not be straightforward. What happens when the world becomes inhospitable? Bram Fischer was on a journey to find a solution to that question. How he did so, with all its complications, is part of his legacy and part of what he still models for us today. Something to ponder, to contemplate, to prompt, because we certainly have our own anomalies. The person who most intimately accompanied Bram on the journey was the woman he married in 1937, Molly Krige. Bram had met Molly at the Ramblers Club in Bloemfontein in 1927, and it seems fell almost instantaneously in love. Bright, vivacious, with a tendency also to darker moods and melancholy, Molly seemed to capture a spirit of freedom and possibility to Bram. Wherever he was going, it was she he wanted to go with. Their courtship, however, was long and somewhat arduous, as Molly felt from time to time unsure of whether she really was in love or who she was in love with. Their paths took them separately for some years. Bram went to Oxford, Molly went to teach in Namibia, he went back to South Africa, she went on a trip to Europe. One benefit for me as biographer is that these years were therefore filled with letters between them. No text messages at that time. Thank goodness, otherwise I would have had nothing to write. I had to deal with feelings of intrusion, even voyeurism, in reading these letters. They were not written for me, but they gave me real access to the people that Bram and Molly were. In the book, I began Molly's story not with her, but with her grandfather, a man named Bernsman, who was a Rhenish missionary in Namibia. He lived in the small settlement of Ochimbingwe, and in the early 1880s wrote to his headquarters to ask them to send him a wife. It's worth bearing in mind as an option. He was not doing very well. His first wife, Emily, had died, and he couldn't look after his children. So he wrote asking for a wife, and his second wife arrived by ship at the Cape, and how Bernsman met her at the docks in Cape Town forms the prologue to my book. Later, his eldest child, Emmy, married a man named Krige and became Molly Krige's mother. I mention this story because in writing it, I drew on the journal Bernsman kept. Describing his journey to Cape Town, he also recorded unrest and conflict in Southwest Africa at the time. In Walvis Bay, he mentioned reports of new skirmishes and raids by the Swart Boers and Nama. May God soon make an end of this thievery, he wrote in his journal, under which uncounted ones suffer from war. That was where I left the matter in the book, but I could have and should have gone further. By 1884, Southwest Africa was a German protectorate. By 1904, conflict with the Nama and Herero led to what was effectively an extermination policy under the direction of General Lothar von Trotter. German forces drove the Nama and Herero into the desert, sealing them off from access to wells. The German forces established concentration camps where large numbers of people perished. By 1908, when Bram Fischer was Prime Minister of the Orange River Colony, up to 100,000 Herero and approximately 10,000 Nama had died. Some historians link these developments in the culture of German militarism to the later concentration camps of Nazi Germany. None of this was the fault of Bernsman or Molly Krige's mother, not least because the key developments came some years later. But it shows that for every inside story, there's also an outside, things we either cannot or do not see at the time. For me, the story formed part of a quasi-mythic arc. My book began in the deserts of Namibia. It ended in the mountains of Lesotho, west to east, across the landscape of South Africa. This traversal mirrored certain biblical themes of exodus, wilderness, and transcendence. But there was this other dimension. Bernsman's story, in and of itself, was one of joy and completion, even in the harsh and demanding landscape in which he labored to save souls. For him, it was a tale of belonging. But for those Nama and Herero, the world was changing irrevocably, becoming profoundly inhospitable. The earth, their earth, was no longer the same place for them. The doubleness of the story depends on where one is standing. Directly, indirectly, this too is part of Bram Fischer's life, as it is undoubtedly of ours, a larger context which at some level, and in principle, he recognized. Who is left out of the story, and how do we make the world more hospitable for them, for everyone? In the 1930s, Bram came to understand that nationalism, previously his guiding light, was at best a chimera, at worst a narrow and calamitous version of identity. In December 1933 in London, on what was then called Dingaan's Day, commemorating the Voortrekker victory at the Battle of Blood River, he made a speech to that effect, pointing out that the one point of view he had never heard discussed regarding the event was the point of view of Dingaan. Today, he remarked, we stand again before a parting of the ways. He might have been referring to this in personal terms, for his own way was leading him out of the inherited encampment. His method seems to have been slow, methodical, deliberate as he fashioned his path. After he and Molly were married, they lived in Johannesburg, where Bram had taken up his profession as an advocate, taking on any work he could get. This was how he came to be an expert in gold mining law, eventually accepting retainers from some of the biggest mining companies. Not bad work for a future communist, another anomaly. At the same time, he was active in liberal organizations, the Joint Council of Africans and Europeans, the Institute of Race Relations, the Alexandra Health Committee. What changed everything for Bram was the war. The key sign here was that Bram was anti-war during the phase of the Nazi-Soviet pact, perhaps an indication that he was already a communist, or at least supported the perplexing Soviet line. But when the Nazi armies invaded Russia in June 1941, Bram was all in, diving into the war effort with everything he had. And there was no doubt this was a key moment, the transformation he'd been waiting for all his life. When I was writing the biography, it was impossible for me to specify exactly when Bram Fischer joined the Communist Party. 1938, 1940, 1942. Different people gave me different information, and there was no party card to verify things. But the case I made was that it didn't matter exactly when he joined. Joining up became a lifelong project for Bram, and it was a joining of many kinds, of his life with Molly, of his work as an advocate with his political commitment, of the anti-imperialism of his parents and grandparents with a new definition of what that meant, of his South African roots with a wider global engagement. It all made sense to him, part of an encompassing philosophy of society, of South Africa, the world, and the future, and he worked tirelessly and selflessly in its cause. The moment was part of a wider transformation as well. When I met Nelson Mandela to interview him for my book, he recalled how, as a confirmed African nationalist, he wanted very little to do with people of other races, notwithstanding their political activity. For him at that stage, communism was just one more foreign colonial import. But Mandela said it was through seeing the dedication of others, such as Fischer, or Joe Slovo, or Yusuf Dadoo, or Ruth First, or Molly Krige, that he came to appreciate their commitment, their willingness to take the same risks, their complete dedication to the cause. These were the roots of the alignments and solidarities that characterized much of the trajectory of the ANC and its allies in the decades going forward. And it's still remarkable to me how much of it was personal. These people knew each other personally, intimately, very close friendships. And if anything is emblematic of this, and it's a story that I've returned to a number of times, concerns Walter Sisulu, who was a frequent visitor in the Fischer household, often staying over at night after meetings. Bram and Molly's youngest child, Paul, suffered from cystic fibrosis. In those days, life expectancy for those who had the disease was very short. Though partly through Bram and Molly's treatment, Paul lived to the age of 23, almost miraculous at that time. When Walter Sisulu stayed over, he would hear Paul coughing in the night and Bram going to his room to care for him. Bram Fischer's children were like my children, said Sisulu. And when he heard that Paul Fischer had died, he said, it was like my own child had died. The statement reflects on Sisulu himself, on his own warmth and humanity, but it also reflects on the Fischers and the environment of which they were a part. This was South Africa as a new place and a new model of belonging, a wider and yet intimate family of comrades whose loyalties were deep and direct. I believe to this day that these connections stood in some regard behind the visions and transformations of 1994. The close-knit political family modeled and invoked the larger family South Africa could be. Bram and Molly's hospitality towards Walter Sisulu, as well as his care for them, were part of a profound quest to make South Africa a place of belonging for all. For hospitality and belonging are deeply connected. If the question comes up, as it must, how Bram Fischer could have remained in the Communist Party through the revelations about Stalin, the purges, the invasion of Hungary in 1956, and so much else, I would say that beyond larger questions of ideology and commitment, these personal loyalties and connections forged in the South African cauldron, had a lot to do with it. Bram then was launched, and these were years of heightened activity, of endless work, of drama, of triumphs and losses. I'll run through these fairly succinctly. After the war, the mood changed almost instantly. 1946, there was the African mine workers' strike, and Bram stood trial with his comrades. The victory of the National Party in 1948 and the institution of apartheid was followed in short order by the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, in the face of which the Communist Party dissolved. In 1951, Bram was named as a communist by the Minister of Justice. That was an official thing. You got named, and that was a form of exclusion. And yet, anomaly after anomaly, in that very same year, he received a letter of congratulation from the very same minister, naming him as King's Counsel, in today's parlance, State Counsel. And the minister who named him was C.R. Swart, whose statue, I gather, was outside this building somewhere until recently. And then by August 1953, Bram was officially banned by the government, barred for 2 years from any gatherings and from membership of various organizations. That same year, the CPSA reconstituted itself clandestinely under a different name, the South African Communist Party, and Bram, as before, was a member of the Central Committee. The lawyer who appeared in a silk gown in court arguing in his mild yet authoritative manner was also a banned individual in the secret leadership of an illegal party. It was quite a combination. By this stage, the era of full-scale oppression in South Africa was underway, yet it was also a classic period of resistance. There were the iconic campaigns, Defiance Campaign of 1951, the Congress of the People in 1955. In August 1956, 20,000 women marched on Pretoria to protest against the extension of the past laws to black women. The state, however, had its own plans. The Congress of the People ended in police raids and the seizure of multitudes of documents. By 1956, the seemingly endless treason trial had begun, with 156 accused. Bram was second in command to a brilliant advocate named Izzy Maisels, representing the defense, and together their team constructed a work of legal genius in defeating the charges. I will say it was one of the benefits for me of writing the biography that I was able to read these political trials and just totally in awe of the work that these lawyers did. In successive stages, by the time the trial ended in 1961, all 156 of the accused had been found innocent. In legal terms, it was a complete and magnificent victory. In some ways, however, it was pain which the prosecution had equated to communism. Yet through the 1950s, the approach of the ANC and its allies had been overwhelmingly peaceful, and the defense could demonstrate this in abundance. The prosecution, in essence, had no case. But by the time the trial ended, all of this was obsolete. In March 1960, there was the Sharpeville massacre, followed by a state of emergency, the outlawing of the ANC, the PAC. The Communist Party was already outlawed. The ANC and the Communist Party formed Umkhonto weSizwe, headed by Nelson Mandela, to undertake the armed struggle and initiate a campaign of sabotage. Things had entered a new phase, and Bram Fischer was decidedly part of it. But it was also a much more threatening time. Whereas before the state had largely followed conventional and legalistic methods, South Africa now entered a darker era of torture and detention without trial, the bannings and arrests of masses of people. For Bram and Molly, the resonances were personal as well as political, and in various ways decisive. As the detentions in the state of emergency began in 1960, Molly herself was detained, along with numbers of other women. When they were moved to Pretoria, the women went on a hunger strike, and eventually they were released after 3 months. Then on the 11th of July 1963, the police raided a set of farmhouses at a place called Lily's Leaf in Rivonia to the north of Johannesburg. This was the headquarters of the Umkhonto leadership, and everyone there was arrested. What followed 9 months later, in April 1964, was the Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela, already in prison, was brought back as accused number 1, and he, along with Walter Sisulu and 7 others, were on trial under the Sabotage Act, at risk of being sentenced to death. The key charge at issue is whether Umkhonto had embarked on a campaign of armed insurrection and guerrilla warfare, as outlined in a document found at Rivonia titled Operation Maibuye. This was an allegation the defense denied. And who was leading the defense at great risk to himself? None other than Bram Fischer. He opened his case by inviting accused number 1 to present a statement from the dock. This was when Nelson Mandela spoke his unforgettable words, announcing his readiness to die for the cause of freedom he believed in. Bram's decision to lead the defense was one of the most courageous and even most outrageous things he ever did. He'd been present many times at Rivonia. It was a matter of luck that he wasn't there on the day the police raided. There were farm workers called as witnesses in the trial who could have identified him. There were documents in Bram's own handwriting which he passed on to his co-counsel, and they saw this, amazed, and tried not to show it. In some ways, risky as it was, leading the defense was the safest place for him to be because the state was unlikely to arrest him under the spotlight of the world. But perhaps most outrageous of all was that in the midst of the trial, Bram continued to meet with his MK and SACP comrades to direct the struggle, developing further sites for sabotage, a sign perhaps of the extremity of the times, but also a contravention of his oaths of fealty to the court and its practices. And in this, Bram occupied a particularly fragile position. He'd been somewhat skeptical of the need for violence to begin with, yet had acceded to majority decisions. As an Afrikaner, he was torn. Mandela said that unlike any of the others, he was fighting against his own people, a much harder struggle. Yet this was an underestimation, in my view, for at stake was precisely who his people were. Everything Bram Fischer did, he undertook so that Afrikaners could take their rightful place in South Africa, along with all its peoples. In the widest frame, it was South Africa's people he identified with. But as he said in his own speech from the dock many years later, he also saw his responsibility that at least one Afrikaner should take it upon himself to fight against the policies his people had instituted. In the end, there were no death sentences, and most of the accused were sentenced to life imprisonment. It was a victory, ensuring the possibility, though no one could have foreseen it at the time, of the resolutions and reconciliations of 1994 after those very same prisoners had been released and their organizations unbanned. Yet for Bram, tragedy followed. Directly after the trial, traveling down with Molly to Cape Town for their daughter Ilse's 21st birthday, and also to visit the Rivonia trialists on Robben Island, in the midst of winter in the Free State, a freak accident saw Bram's car veer off the road and into a deep pool of water. Bram dived and did what he could, but that was where Molly Fischer drowned. Bram had helped save the lives of his comrades. His own wife had died. 2 days before the Rivonia trial began, Molly had sent a letter to Ilse, apologizing for not having written before. "Life is just too depressing," she wrote. Dennis Goldberg was one of the Rivonia accused, and Molly told Ilse how Dennis's wife Esme had been arrested at the Fisher swimming pool. Heaven only knows how they knew she was here. Bram and Molly had built that pool as a place where Paul, with his cystic fibrosis, could get much-needed exercise. But it also became an emblem, that pool, of Fisher hospitality, where comrades of all races gathered together on weekends, reinforcing their friendship and bonds. Now it had become a place of loss and emptiness. Molly wrote to Ilse, "Alles sal regkom, jy sal sien." Everything will come right, you'll see. Alles sal regkom, the resonant South African phrase once uttered by President Brunt of the Free State. Did Molly believe it? Everything did not come right, not least for Bram himself in the aftermath of her death. This earth, was no longer quite the same place to him. What happens when the world becomes inhospitable? How would he deal with it? Let me draw away from Bram Fischer's life for a moment by way of thinking of his relevance for us now. Here are some items from the news in the period while I was preparing this lecture. These are tales of incongruity in the strange world we face at the moment. In June 2023, the Greek Coast Guard refused to assist a fishing trawler named the Adriana, packed with some 750 refugees trying to reach Italy. The trawler sank and approximately 600 of the refugees drowned, including women and children trapped in the lower deck. As it happened, 100 of those who survived were loaded onto a luxury $175 million yacht, furnished with jacuzzis and a swimming pool, which took them to port. And if you see the photographs, it's a bizarre combination. Just weeks later, another vessel for the super rich, the Titan, imploded at the bottom of the ocean on a tourist trip to see the Titanic. The world was transfixed as enormous resources of various countries searched for days for the submersible and any survivors. There were no survivors, but the spectacle provided quite a contrast with the fate of those refugees who had died in the Mediterranean. And since absurdity is also part of this picture, I couldn't help noticing a report from another undersea voyager who commented on what he found in his own explorations. This was a scientist. At the bottom of the ocean off the Oregon coast in the USA, what did he find there? A Reebok sneaker, some sign of how our world is organized at the moment. And what of the wider picture? Russia's war against Ukraine has been going on for some 20 months. Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner mercenary group, active both there and in Africa, led a bizarre and abortive coup against Vladimir Putin and was later blown up in an airplane for his pains, something I think that was completely predictable. The long war in Syria has killed and displaced untold numbers of people, many of whom have joined the lines of refugees looking for safety in Europe. The current misery in Israel, Palestine, shows the inevitable devastation that follows on from maximalist identitarian politics. In terms of climate change, July the 3rd to the 5th, 2023 were declared the hottest days ever on Earth, and July the hottest month. There have been wildfires from Australia to the US to Greece to Canada, an earthquake in Morocco, a devastating flood in Libya. In the midst of this, melting ice caps and the drainage of groundwater around the world have produced a startling result. The Earth has literally shifted on its axis. This is no longer a metaphor. The Earth has actually shifted on its axis, a little bit, but it has shifted. Of course, South Africa has had its own drama, from Marikana to Phala to corruption and state capture, load shedding, water issues, land issues, unemployment, failures in education, a dreadful fire in Johannesburg, floods in Cape Town. 30 years on, the transition of 1994 remains unfulfilled. It is worth saying that both here and elsewhere in the world, many are active, doing extraordinary and creative things. But no surprise that people may feel a little panicked if they think very much about the state of things today. The past, for all its ills, may appear in retrospect to have had some clarity, to have been a simpler time when what was right and what was wrong was very clear. By contrast, the present, to adopt the title of an Oscar-winning movie, may seem like everything, everywhere, all at once. We live in times that are dispersed, disaggregated, even desperate, involving what the Bulgarian writer Georgi Gospodinov calls a deficit of the future. A term has been invented to describe all this, solastalgia. It means nostalgia, not for a place one has left, but for a place that has left the self. Homesickness for a world that used to be, or perhaps for many, not least in South Africa, that never came fully into being. The earth is not earth. This place is a place now changed for me. What happens when the world becomes inhospitable? What models can we draw on? After visiting the prisoners on Robben Island as planned, Bram would not tell them what had happened to Molly. He himself was detained, released, and then put on trial with his other comrades for membership of the Communist Party. During that time, he applied for bail and a passport to enable him to argue a case before the Privy Council in London, giving his word that he would return. And quite strangely, the state allowed him to do so, I think perhaps hoping that he would stay overseas. His comrades in England tried to persuade him to stay, but he did go home. This was his place. This was the definition of his life. But sometime after the trial resumed in January 1966, Bram did not appear in court. He had gone underground at the age of 58 to carry on the struggle as best he could. In his letter to the court explaining his absence, he defined it as what he called a supreme duty, particularly for an Afrikaner. I can no longer serve justice in the way I've attempted to do during the past 30 years, he wrote. I can only do it in the way I have now chosen. His own colleagues on the Johannesburg Bar Council, which he had chaired for a good many years, submitted an application to disbar him, something that tore at Bram's heart. Bram had chosen justice rather than the law, a revolutionary act in its own way. Underground and in disguise, he took on a new identity as Mr. Black. The name could not have been accidental. Supported by a small group of comrades, he ventured into the domains of Johannesburg, even visiting chambers in disguise, the building that housed his former law officers. On the streets, he passed policemen who knew him in his previous life. Newspaper reports of sightings of Fischer abounded. Being at large was a victory in itself, yet his options were few. Under regimes of detention and torture, the resistance movements were ragged and in disarray. So it was that 10 months later, torture did what torture does, and on the very day that Rhodesia announced its unilateral declaration of independence from Britain, Bram was arrested in his car near the home he had set up in Corlett Drive in Johannesburg. He was put on trial again, and this time the consequences were more dire. Bram faced the same charges the Rivonia trialists had faced. And that was how on Monday, March the 28th, 1966, Bram rose to present his speech from the dock. This was when he remembered his young black friends on the farm, the decisive handshake in Bloemfontein that caused his life to change, the first step, as he put it, towards the Communist Party, which believed in, as he termed it, the eventual brotherhood of all men. His main aim, he insisted, had been to prevent bloodshed and civil war, the consequences of which would be horrifying and permanent. It was to keep faith with all those dispossessed by apartheid that he took on the life of a fugitive. I owed it to the political prisoners, to the banished, to the silenced, and to those under house arrest, not to remain a spectator, but to act. I knew what they expected of me, and I did it. I felt responsible not to those who are indifferent to the sufferings of others, but to those who are concerned. Bram drew towards a close with a clarifying statement. All the conduct with which he had been charged had been directed towards maintaining contact and understanding between the races of this country. If one day it helped build a bridge enabling peaceful negotiation to settle the destinies of all, he said, I shall be able to bear with fortitude any sentence which this court may impose on me. It will be a fortitude, my Lord, strengthened by this knowledge at least, that for the past 25 years I have taken no part, not even by passive acceptance, in that hideous system of racial discrimination which we have erected in this country and which has become a byword in the civilized world. Quite deliberately, he ended with words from Paul Kruger in Dutch. De vryheid zal in Afrika rijzen als de zon uit de morgenwolken. Freedom shall rise in Africa like the sun from the morning clouds. In prison, Bram was persecuted by a warder named Dupré. He was given clothes too big for him. He was made to clean the toilets with rags. When his son Paul died in 1971, he was not allowed to attend the funeral and had to spend the night alone. Yet along with his comrades, Bram found his rhythm in prison, standing up to the authorities, demanding that rights be observed. Political struggle carried on, even there. And warders came to him too for advice. One, supervising an exam Bram was taking through UNISA, allowed him extra time. Ach Bram, vat maar nog 'n paar minute, so to say, beseringstyd. Bram had been a rugby player in his past. Take another couple of minutes, so to speak, injury time. But then came the news of Bram's illness, his cancer, the campaigns for his release, his eventual return to his brother Paul's house here in Bloemfontein, declared prison territory for the purpose. Bram died on Thursday, 8th of May, 1975, Ascension Day. After he was cremated, his ashes became property of the prisons department and were never returned to his family. In his brother Paul's house, Bram may have seen the toy carved for him by one of the rebel prisoners in Bloemfontein all those many years before. In prison, it's worth saying, Bram also became a gardener, tending flowers through the seasons. In their home in Beaumont Street in Johannesburg, Molly had fashioned a most beautiful garden, and this was Bram's turn in quite different circumstances. In this one last way, he is perhaps an emblem for us now. The earth, in one sense, is our prison. We have nowhere else to go, unless that dubious ex-South African Elon Musk lands us all on Mars. But the earth is also a garden of which we are a part. Prison or garden, garden or prison. I don't mean to be glib in suggesting that this is also our life sentence. It has to do with our lives, the lives of those around us, and the lives of those to come. What kind of life will it be? And what kind of sentence in every sense of the word? What kind of meaning will we make of our lives? What kind of meaning will we make in the world? Everything, everywhere, all at once. If the earth is beginning to seem somewhat inhospitable to us now, it's because we've been inhospitable to it. We've been inhospitable to our fellow human beings and to the planet itself. The two aspects go together. If this place seems no longer a place to us, not what it used to be or still might become, that's because of what we've made of it. That is certainly true of those who have resources and power. To that extent, we've not got over the habits of the capitalist present, the colonial past, and a morbid global system. And some of us clearly bear more responsibility for this than others. Yet no matter who we are, we're all implicated because, as the COVID pandemic showed us and climate change reinforces every day, we're part of a world without intrinsic boundaries. And yet, so many boundaries remain. How do we live in the boundary spaces between people, between here and there, between past and future? How do we make those spaces more hospitable in the most meaningful and profound ways? And how do we do this in a hugely differentiated and uneven world? That was what Bram Fischer tried to do. Many have only ever known an inhospitable world. Some of us are just beginning to find out what it means, and generations beyond us will have to face what we leave behind. What will we make of this earth so that it can be a place for all, undoing millennia of damage and fulfilling millennia of promise? How will we make it a place of justice for all? What will our model of hospitality be? And how will we extend it beyond its accustomed boundaries? What commitments will we follow as we face our own critical tasks? There will be many hard decisions to make. In this regard, the life of Bram Fischer, in all its complexity and fidelity, challenges us profoundly. Bram Fischer was able to live both in his own time and in a time beyond his time, when the earth would be a place for all, a home, a place of belonging. What happens when the world becomes inhospitable? It's up to us to find out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There is a Google page in front of me which says nearly 20 million people are victims of human trafficking every day. So I need to switch off the screen. All right, it turns out that I can't. It's not a... All right, I think I can do this now. Even that is not going to work. Anyway. I think I must stick to my brief as a good advocate. Thank you, Stephen. That was riveting. Even better when it's said than when it's read, actually, because your presentation was really, truly excellent. And thank you, Professor Peterson, for allowing us to use your space, or the space that you are currently using. And thank you, Danny, for the invitation. It was really, I couldn't say no as soon as I saw it was you. Because you had invited me before and I turned you down or something. So I sort of felt, no, let me say yes. But really I couldn't say no to this occasion. I have a short reply. In legal terms, 10 pages is short. It is a pleasure to give this rejoinder, and even greater pleasure to respond to Stephen Clingman, whose biography of Bram Fischer is an immense credit to Bram Fischer and his times. In fact, this is not a rejoinder. It is a brief and a momentary reflection. And the momentary part is not about the length of time that I shall take to deliver it, but it is about the moment. Bram's life, according to Stephen, embodies contradiction, moral clarity, and political promise. Let me start with contradiction. When Bram became Queen's Counsel in 1951, his latest patent, the document marking the achievement of silk status. Are there any silks here? Okay, they will know what the latest patent is. Marking his achievement of silk status was endorsed by the Governor General, who was a representative of the British Crown when the reigning monarch was Elizabeth II. While South Africa was not a colony as such, it remained tied to the British Empire, and imperialism was the primary target of international communism. In fact, it was Bram's South African Communist Party in 1962 which characterized the South African situation as a colonialism of a special type, because the masses of the people enjoy neither independence nor freedom. While the British colonial government had granted independence to South Africa in 1910, this was not a victory over the forces of colonialism and imperialism. Instead, power was transferred into the hands of the white minority, with the result that for the black majority, the evils of colonialism were perpetuated and reinforced, unquote. Queen's Counsel no doubt gave Bram great professional prestige. The whites-only National Party government, which birthed apartheid as the official policy of the state, also had its own contradictions. While Bram was being conferred the honor of Queen's Counsel, he was also, you heard from Stephen, receiving his banning orders in terms of the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. And, as you also heard, Bram was on a retainer from Anglo-American, which meant that he had to remain available to Anglo at any stage where his services were required. Yes, we as advocates are bound by the cab rank rule. We have to accept a brief if we are available and the fee is reasonable. But a retainer stands on a less secure footing when it comes to the constraints imposed by the cab rank rule. Much of what we know today about Anglo's practices in the mines was known even back then. Black workers could not strike, they could be fired at will, and they lived in dismal conditions. My father was one of them. Detention, jail sentences, whipping were routine forms of punishment. And as an enterprise, Anglo was exceptionally profitable. So big and so influential was Anglo that, in fact, by some accounts, the company's fortunes were shaped by and in turn shaped South Africa itself. In 1946, the strike by the black mine workers in the gold mines under the leadership of the African Mine Workers Union was suppressed by state violence. Anglo was the main employer in the gold sector. Just like in Marikana, the state was at the forefront of protecting the interests of mine owners. And also like in Marikana, the 1946 strike resulted in a massacre. The police shot and injured 1,200 workers. They killed 12. Of course, Bram was not party to Anglo's extractionism. To the contrary, in true revolutionary fashion, during the strike, he wrote a subversive and anonymous text about the strike, which is still available at the Wits Historical Archives, which describes the mines as virtual concentration camps with miners locked in and outsiders locked out. In time, he would visualize an end to the strike and perhaps an end to apartheid itself. This is what the anonymous text says. This strike will reach its conclusion with the establishment of a living wage for all South African workers. This will be the time to assess calmly and sum up all the significance of it. That will be the time when the miners' strike of 1946 and the 100,000 who conducted it will take their rightful place in the history of progress and liberation of South Africa. That strike would lead to Bram's first encounter with the law as an accused, not a lawyer. Communists of Bram's vintage rejected the law as a superstructure of society. In fact, this was not just a Marxist idea, it was Marx's idea, who said, society does not rest on law. That is a fantasy of jurists. Any judges here? Although a communist, Bram's first and abiding love was the law. While most of the law consists in written texts, it is sustained by unwritten conventions, an undertaking made to a court by an advocate, especially senior counsel. What can I say? Is generally to be accepted without question. Although they must represent their clients without fear, advocates are also court officers of the court. Their primary duty is to the court. In that sense, advocates must assist the court in the administration of justice. But this can be an invidious task. On the one hand, an advocate must represent their client and treat the information given to them with discretion, even if it discloses violations of the law by the client. Yet, on the other hand, as an officer of the court, an advocate must ensure that the court is not misled. Bram's contradiction was not the decision to break his word to the court, first telling the judge that he would stand trial and then evading it. It is really what happened during the Rivonia trial, where Bram was counsel for the accused. We know this from the record of the trial and from the evidence of one of Bram's chief betrayers, Petrus Bielefeld. When Bram was charged, Bielefeld was the star witness for the state. He began his story to the court by explaining an underground encounter with Bram, right at Lilliesleaf, the site of the arrest of the first Rivonia accused in the case which became known as S versus Walter Sisulu and 6 others. This is what Bielefeld said. It was shortly afterwards when I was asked to attend a meeting at which, among others, Bram was present, and I was told that Bram himself and Mrs. Slovo were the only members of the Central Committee left in Johannesburg. The others had been arrested at Rivonia, and I was asked, among others, to become a member of the new Central Committee, which was then constituted, close quote. This is illuminating evidence, even if it is not explosive. Bram had taken the brief of the Rivonia accused as an advocate. An advocate is advised never to implicate themselves in the business of their client, lest their judgment be impaired. Yet Bram is here with Bielefeld and with one Ludi in a secret cell of the Communist Party. Ludi turned out to be a police informer who had joined the Communist Party with the aim of infiltration. Armed with a secret recording machine, Ludi would send intelligence information to the police on a regular basis, which implicated Bram in the activities of his criminally accused clients. Being on the scene of the crime as your client is a gravely compromising position for an advocate. This is why Bram had refused to run the case of the Rivonia accused. It was his junior colleagues, Advocate Arthur Chaskalson and Advocate George Bezos, who prevailed upon him to take the case. His clients, including Walter Sisulu, Dennis Goldberg, and Nelson Mandela, understood the reasons for his reluctance and were only too grateful that he agreed to lead the case. There was personal embarrassment too, as Bram was persistently taunted in the Rivonia trial by Percy Yuta, the state prosecutor, who had access to security information implicating Bram and deployed it against him with great cynicism. There was the Communist Party, Bielefeld testified, and Bram was one of its leading members. The party had received money from London. Some of the money went to the African National Congress, and some to the nascent guerrilla movement, Umkhonto weSizwe. The latter's role was sabotage of identified state installations, avoiding the loss of life, but sabotage nevertheless. Bram was at the center of it, according to Bielefeld, conceiving, thinking, strategizing, directing, and paying. And then, when it was all done, covering it all up. Advocate Sidney Kentridge, who appeared for Bram, the accused, tried to minimize the damage in his skillful but short cross-examination. The evidence of the state was simply too much. Bram was just deep in it. There is contradiction here, as Stephen pointed out. Bram was in an armed insurrection mode at night. In the morning, he donned his silk gown and carried on with the rituals of the law. Although the prosecutors had argued that Bram should not be granted bail as there was a risk of him not returning from London, where he was at the Privy Council, in fact, this is a great paradox. Bram kept his word and attended his trial. This was his land. He was the son of the soil. It was only on the 25th of January 1965, after some of the evidence had been laid, that he absented himself from the case. When he did so, he broke the law, not his word, not a promise, it was the law. The law is broken daily these days, and we regard this as a big deal. People who break the law, we say, should be punished. Sometimes we even ask for the death penalty. This was the case even then. Bram's society, which was a white upper-class society with a tinge of racism, also felt the way we do. On the 4th of February 1965, Bram sought to capture the prevailing sentiment of white society in a letter to the court. And these are his words. I was facing, if convicted, an indeterminate sentence which would be imposed at the sole and unfettered discretion of the Minister of Justice. We have already seen how this type of sentence has been imposed upon Mr. Sobukwe, and we have already seen how European public opinion in this country, to its lasting disgrace, has failed to register any protest against this arbitrary incarceration and complacently accepted this total abolition of the rule of law. You see, Bram felt the pain of another son of the soil, Robert Sobukwe, incarcerated from 1963 until 1969 in Robben Island under the notorious Sobukwe Clause. For its collective failure to protest against the unjust imprisonment of Sobukwe by a politician, not a judge, white society, according to Bram, was a disgrace. There was, of course, Helen Suzman, a white woman of a liberal political disposition, who did take up the cudgels on behalf of Sobukwe. On the 23rd of March 1966, as a captured man, Bram was indicted for the second time on 15 counts. Some were political, in the sense that he was charged with membership of the Communist Party and furthering its aims and objectives, conspiring with the ANC and its leaders, including a fellow advocate, Advocate Dumalisile Nokwe, the first black advocate at the Johannesburg Bar. Bram was also charged with common law crimes of fraud, forgery, and uttering. While these charges were framed as criminal offenses, they were in substance political. Take, for instance, the explanation behind count number 13 of forgery and uttering. This was the allegation of the state, in that during the period 25 January 1965 to 11th November 1965 at Johannesburg, the said accused, Bram, did wrongfully and unlawfully, falsely and with intent to defraud and to the prejudice of the state, forge an identity card purporting to be issued by the Population Register Bureau to one D. Black. So what was going on? Bram had changed his identity card. He pretended to be someone else, Douglas Black. This is forgery, but it is political. Judge Boshoff's sentence, delivered months after Bram had defaulted from his trial, ultimately sentenced Bram to a combination of sentences, but redounding to a life sentence. Bram, however, was double punished. A year earlier, on the 2nd of November 1965, a judgment was given by Quatas de Wet, the judge-president of the Transvaal, to remove Bram's name from the roll of practicing advocates. In this instance, Nelson Mandela, Bram's client, confidant, and co-conspirator, was treated better by the system. In Incorporated Law Society versus Mandela, a judgment of 1954, despite the conviction for subversion, the court refused to strike Mandela's name from the roll of attorneys, holding that such acts did not implicate Mandela in dishonesty or dishonor. This meant that, unlike Bram, Mandela did not lose his right to practice law. There was no respite for Bram. His infringements were unforgivable to the state, unforgivable also to his colleagues at the Johannesburg bar. Bram's name was only reinstated to the roll of practicing advocates posthumously, exactly 20 years ago, on the 15th of October 2003. In May 1975, while still a prisoner, but now under house arrest, Bram would die an agonizing, painful, slow, isolated death. Cancer was the medical diagnosis, but he could also have died of a broken heart at the pain inflicted by his people, the Afrikaners, against his people, the Africans. A photograph of him in black and white pajamas, sitting on a wheelchair, pale, gaunt, and hairless, is a haunting image of his last days. No longer the confident, healthy-looking, bespectacled Queen's Counsel who once graced the front benches of our superior courts. With his beloved wife, Molly, having died in tragic circumstances in 1964, Bram had not wanted to speak about it. When Mandela was a prisoner at Robben Island, it was a warder who broke the news of Molly's passing, despite Bram having visited him. A letter of condolences which Mandela had written together with his prison comrades did not reach Bram. Plainly intercepted by the prison authorities, it was a source of great pain to Mandela to learn that Bram never got to know how sorry they were for his loss. But as Mandela remembered in the inaugural Bram Fischer Lecture organized by the Legal Resources Center in 1995, Bram was never one to burden others with his own pain. Perhaps it is enough now to talk about Bram and his moral torments. Stephen's lecture has been about what happens when the world becomes inhospitable. Bram's world was always inhospitable. The idyllic whites-only conditions of October 1898, where the lecture commences, were disquieting and discomforting for Bram, the grandson of Abraham and the son of Percy. Percy and Abraham, the senior, accepted that world. They created it for young Bram. But young Bram had imagined a new world. There is a message behind this, I think. Bram's own lesson is contained in a letter which in today's parlance we would describe as viral. Everybody everywhere has seen it, and they quote it for different reasons. The letter is dated 22 January 1965, and in it, Bram sees it as a duty of every true opponent of the apartheid government to remain in this country and to oppose its monstrous policy of apartheid. Bram's own explanation for breaking the law is contained in his own statement from the dock, and perhaps there is no contradiction after all. He accepted the general rule that for the protection of a society, laws should be obeyed. But when the laws themselves become immoral and require the citizen to take part in an organized system of oppression, if only by his silence and apathy, then I believe that a higher duty arises. This compels me to refuse to recognize such laws. This statement is often used in academic journals to illustrate the ethical dilemma a lawyer faces when the law is morally corrupt. Maybe tonight there is nothing more to say about that. The world of Bram was already hospitable, but it was hospitable for the few, inhospitable for the many, hospitable for the white-skinned descendants of Europe, inhospitable for the flat-nosed, brown-skinned indigenous people. It is for the latter people, the brown-skinned indigenous people who are also flat-nosed, that he sought to make the world hospitable. He said so himself. It was to keep faith with all those dispossessed by apartheid that I broke my undertaking to the court, that I separated myself from my family, pretended that I was someone else, and accepted the life of a fugitive. I felt responsible, not to those who are indifferent to the suffering of others, but to those who are concerned. Let's repeat this. Keeping faith with all those who are dispossessed by apartheid. But how? The dispossession was by the Natives Land Act. It was by the Group Areas Act. It was by the Bantu Education Act. And so apartheid was the ultimate act of disembodiment of African society. There are two human characteristics to note here, and that explain Bram's decision: empathy and virtue. Bram did not need to empathize with the dispossessed. This takes us to Immanuel Kant's phrase of the crooked timber of humanity. Isaiah Berlin is the modern philosopher who made the phrase popular in the book with the subtitle, Chapters in the History of Ideas. The full quote from Kant is, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." Berlin's argument is to accept that as human beings, we already proceed from a morally compromised position, and we should not aspire to build heaven on earth. Bram sought moral clarity because he appreciated how utterly morally compromised white society, which tolerated apartheid racism, had been. In fact, when he decided to disobey the law, that was the moment at which he got moral clarity. And it liberated him from any moral dilemmas so that he could act as dictated to by his conscience. He wanted to make the world hospitable. In Kant's word, trying to build a straight thing. This is a form of idealism, I admit. Bram chose the side of the oppressed and accepted the consequences that came with that choice. He did not judge Mandela. He did not judge Duma Nokwe or Joe Slovo. All of these were lawyers. They faced the same ethical dilemmas that he did. They also had families. Questions asked about why the grandson of a former prime minister and the son of a judge president made the choices that he did not only perplexed but also annoyed him. Mandela remembered this. Bram was asked whether his sacrifice of family and legal practice had been worth it. He was, according to Mandela, totally offended by the question. And he replied sharply, "Did you ask Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, or Kathy Kathrada, or any others that have already suffered this punishment? And if not, why do you ask me?" In many ways, the world of Bram, in its material forms, remains. Bram was the inheritor of the privileges conferred on the white population by the overall policy of apartheid, whose roots lie in the colonization of African soil by Europeans. What distinguished Bram was the belief in an idea that he could achieve a world different to his own. But he accepted that this required an instability, perhaps discomfort in his own world first. In other words, to make the world hospitable, we should first pass through inhospitability. This takes me to the last point. For blacks, South Africa has remained inhospitable for decades. Many of us trace this inhospitability to the continuum of colonization, land dispossession, slavery, plunder of natural resources during the diamond and gold scramble, and then apartheid, all of which have laid the foundations for deep structural inequalities. These inequalities persist despite the marvelous reforms of the recent past, which have been underpinned by our great constitution. Bram was the first Afrikaner to publicly question the orthodoxies of apartheid. And when he did so, he found it wanting, and it was unable to contend with the force of his ideas. Its only reply were savage reprisals, of which he was one of the prime targets. Today in South Africa, in which we live under the rule of law and a supreme constitution, which is based on equality, human dignity, and freedom, was the country of Bram's dreams. Bram was betrayed by many when he was alive. Even in death, I fear that we have continued to betray his dream. As a communist, Bram wanted a classless society. As a human being, he fought for a common humanity. As Bram realized, this was not possible without first confronting white racism. Freedom has come. White racism is no longer the official state policy, although it continues to thrive in different guises. Stephen has referenced the idea of the deficit of the future. Our collective future in this country is also insecure because of racialized structural inequalities. In 2018, the World Bank noted that South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, with 76% of the population living in poverty. 30% of the population is chronically poor. An overwhelming number of those classified as non-poor face the risk of slipping into the chronically poor category. Race, gender, and income disparity explain the depth of South Africa's inequality. Africans are at the highest risk of being poor. Children, large families, and people living in rural areas are especially vulnerable to remaining impoverished for lengthy periods. Poverty is also gendered. The incidence of poverty is higher for African women. Most municipalities in the 20 poorest local municipalities are in the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal. Of these, the 10 poorest municipalities are in the former homelands, including Qwaqwa, by the way, highlighting the enduring legacy of apartheid. We have become accustomed to the notion that education will end poverty. This was the idea behind universalizing access to education, which has resulted in an incredibly large number of black children who have access to both secondary and university education. It is hoped by universal access to education that education will take the poor out of poverty. This is true, but as the World Bank notes, while education can contribute to poverty reduction, asset distribution is a stronger indicator of who is poor and who is not. And this is what the World Bank said. For the poor, the financial assets represent 30% of total assets, whilst among the rich, financial assets represent 75%. Furthermore, ownership of financial assets features prominently among the factors that influence wealth inequality. What this means is that we do not need education instead of redistribution. To make a decisive break with the trappings of the past, we need both redistribution and education. The future, according to the World Bank, for the poor is bleak. That is because wealth and poverty transfers across generations. At least a third of all children born to very poor parents will likely remain poor, while children of rich parents will likely become rich themselves. So wealth calcifies at the top and does not automatically trickle down. Since generally whites are at the top and Africans at the bottom of the economic ladder, calcification of wealth means the continuation of white wealth and black poverty. Unless there is a fundamental reorganization of the economic structures which changes the paradigm in favor of poor black South Africans. Bram's life was one of idealism. We need his idealism these days, not to make the world a perfect place, but to end human suffering. This is what we can all agree on, even if there is disagreement about so much else. Bram stood for the simple yet profound demands to end racism and to end economic injustice. In short, to end human suffering. This is what we should work for. There is no guarantee that we will succeed, but the meaning of Bram's life is that we should at least try. Thank you.
Thank you, Tembeka. That was brilliant, marvelous, compelling. I had thought I'd wanted to reply. Now I'm not so sure that I want to say anything. It's just that, interestingly, I live in the US at the moment, and much of what you describe about wealth distribution and racial categorization and stratification applies in other places in the world as well, not just in South Africa. I think I just want to draw very, very briefly just a couple of points that occur to me, partly because I've been in discussion over the past day with members of the law faculty who've invited me here. And it feels to me that the history of South Africa demonstrates the bivalency of law. Law can be an instrument of oppression, but it can also be an instrument of liberation. And when it becomes an instrument of liberation, it's because it's connected with the question of justice. And it feels to me that what Bram Fischer did was reimagine what the law meant and to tilt it in the direction of justice rather than just the law. And one shouldn't underestimate what that meant to him. He did come out of a family tradition, which he respected and felt strongly about. But when it came to it, I think he knew where he stood. And, for as long as he could, those two things could work together through those political trials of the 1950s, 60s, and so on. But when it could no longer work, he made his decision. At the age of 58, I don't know how many people are 58 in this room, but it's not easy to go into disguise, to go underground, to shed your life, to become someone different. It's an incredible thing. It's a huge challenge, which he undertook. So he was ready to reimagine himself. But I do want to say, and Tembeka made the point as well, that for him, this was not a sacrifice. It was a way of finding himself. He found himself in relation to others. And it feels to me that as we look around the world today, not only in South Africa but elsewhere, the problem of identity, who we are, how we relate to others, is a huge issue. We see it working out. Why does Donald Trump want to build a wall, on the southern border? Why is there a wall in Israel-Palestine? I'm one of the few whites who walk in the street here in Bloemfontein. I've been doing it over the past couple of days. There's not too many white people walking in the streets. But there are walls and fences and electric fences. The history of walls is very much part of this country's reality. One of the first things that Jan van Riebeeck did when he landed in the Cape in 1652 was to build a hedge to keep the Khoi and San people out. And since then, the history of walls and separation has been very much part of this country. It feels to me that what Bram Fischer stood for was undoing those walls, finding a way to change who we are and our sense of ourselves. It's a hard thing to do, but it feels to me really crucial. One of my obsessions is to think about boundaries. And we think about a boundary as being a limit, a wall you can't get across. I prefer to think of the boundary as a space we can inhabit, a space between people, a space between the present and the future, the past, the present, and the future. We all live in those boundary spaces. And if we do that as honestly as we can, as ethically as we can, I think some of the disparities that Tembeka outlined so powerfully will no longer make sense. And that's a challenge for everybody. It's not easy to do, to commit oneself to that. But I think that's a profound challenge we face now. And that, to me, is part of Bram Fischer's continuing legacy and challenge to us. But if we can regard it not as a problem, but as a solution, as a way of not of losing ourselves, but of finding ourselves, I think it becomes a way of having a different perspective on these things. So that for me is a very, very personal lesson that I take from Bram Fischer's life, recognizing for myself that I have not had the courage that he had, that many of us don't, but he stands as an emblem of what's possible and truly meaningful in that way. It's really been one of the most enriching aspects of the life that I've lived, to being able to write the biography, to meet the people that Bram Fischer knew, to meet his family, to engage with his life, and I hope the meaning of his life. And just as it's a very meaningful thing for me to be here today. So again, my thanks to Dani, my thanks to Professor Peterson, to everybody for inviting us and just for having this lecture. It's such an important thing. So my good wishes to all of you, and thanks very much.
I will not try to comment on the lecture or the responses, simply because it was excellent, and I would like us to give them another round of applause. So I would like to start by thanking Mrs. Ilse Wilson, Bram Fischer's daughter, for coming all the way from Johannesburg to grace us with her presence. I would like to thank Stephen Clingman and Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. I did not spell your name. I tried, I think. Also for coming here. Stephen from the US and Tembeka from Johannesburg, and for preparing and presenting the lecture and the response. Thank you very much, sir. I would like to thank Judge President Musi and Deputy Judge President Mbele of the Free State High Court for gracing us with their presence. And I will use this opportunity to also thank Justice Mbele, with whom we are working on mentorship programs for female law students. Thank you, Justice. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Justice Albisak, who is online, and we will be hosting him here on the 7th of December in the occasion of Human Rights Day. So we are very grateful that he was online tonight with us. All the other members of the audience for their presence and enthusiasm. I would like as well to thank Dr. Molapo Kobela for conceptualizing and driving the resurrection of the Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture and giving us the opportunity to arrange it. Thank you, Dr. Molapo, whom I affectionately call His Excellency. I would also like to thank our VC, Prof. Francis Peterson, for taking this event under his wing and allowing us to call it a Vice-Chancellor Prestige event. And of course, for also funding everything related to this event. Thank you for your support. Thank you. I would also like to thank Prof. Vasuridi, our DVC for Research and Internationalization, for enthusiastically arranging several other events during the course of this week to make the week a Bram Fischer Memorial Week, including the book launch on apartheid legacy that will take place tomorrow. We will have among the speakers our own Prof. Salim Bedat. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the team of the Free State Center for Human Rights for organizing the event over the last several months, in particular the tireless Mawanda Mukwena, without whom there won't be a Free State Center for Human Rights, and this lecture would not have happened tonight. Thank you, Mawanda. Thank you very much. I would also like to extend our gratitude to Nita Ramnat, Alicia Pena, Lesha Loda, and Ms. Quinta Onyango for marketing and events, for especially seeing to the invitation and arrangements for the evening. Last but not least, to the Jove Trust and Sir Sidney Kentridge for their generous funding of the Bram Fischer Memorial Lectures. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to invite, as I will invite people to go out for refreshment, please kindly allow our VIP guests and our speakers to go before we can all follow. But before we get to that, please let's clap the hands when we give the present to our speakers. Thank you. So I am very, very grateful. The Faculty of Law is grateful for your presence here, and we hope to have many more events of this nature. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you.